So over here I'm drawing out the project. But basically the goal is going to be to remove that leg, and that leg. And over here to this leg, it's just gonna be replaced with a diagonal brace that goes down to the baseboard. That's going to support this edge of the table, while the rest of the table, where it's by the wall, will be screwed into the framing of the house. And that's going to be done by using a trim that goes around the whole perimeter of the table. And that trim is going to stick down like an inch, and then it's going to be screwed in to the framing, and then the table is going to sit in that. So it's going to act as the support for the table, and it's going to be the decoration that goes around and makes the table look really good. So I made a bunch of blueprints on Canva, and you can see these arrows, they point to the perimeter trim, which also doubles as an L bracket for supporting the table. Here it is in a section view where you can clearly see the L bracket shape. Pause these if you want to look at them more in depth. And over here, I'm going to have a scaled down version of the exact table I'm going to build, but it's going to be right here in this corner of the wall. And it's going to be just a low surface where you can put laptop and book and that kind of stuff over there. So try and make a hole for those cables to control that. A really nice table where I can study and stuff without listening to that shit. So anyways, that's the plan.
Before anything, hasta la vista, baby.
So using some 2mm poly stapled to the ceiling and draping it down, then taping the bottom edge, I was able to create this sort of dust control zone where I could bring in all the tools and, you know, do my cutting without having to worry about dust flying all over my house. The staples aren't a problem since this whole room is getting renovated anyways, but I still wanted a dedicated work zone. A good tip is to have your layout done on the bottom of the table. This way, when you follow the line with the saw, you can see it, but you also won't end up with all these frayed pieces of wood on the edge, on the top of your table. So in this case, this is the bottom, but it's actually the top of the table, and the saw leaves a really clean edge, unlike the actual top, which is actually the bottom of the table, where it's going to have all that damage. The biggest challenge with making guides is working around the motor saw, because clamps usually get in the way of the saw, so you have to put them away from the path of the saw, and you end up with things like this. Yep, so we cut it out. This is going to be the table. You can see how clean the cuts are. No frayed plywood veneer. Now I'm going to make the shelf where I can just put a laptop. And with the miter saw, you can see that now I'm actually going to cut with the actual top of the table facing up, because if you're using the circular saw, you have to flip it upside down, but with the miter saw, since the saw is coming down, the blowout happens on the bottom instead of happening on the top. So I can just place it on, cut it without changing or flipping the piece of wood, and the top veneer will not have the blowout. Alright, so it's time to make the trim support piece. All I'm going to do is take this 3 1/4 by 3 1/4 piece of lumber, and it's going to be glued and screwed to the 3 1/4 by 2 inches lumber. And then this will form an L bracket that will go around the table and provide support. The lumber store only sell material thick 3/4. So here I made the trim piece. You can see how it's glued and screwed, and I've got a clamp at the end. No screws at the end so it doesn't split. So I'm gonna make enough of these to go around the entire perimeter of the table. Here's the next one. Basically just equally spacing the screws with some glue underneath, and then letting it dry, and then I can even remove the screws if I want to, because the glue is all I need there, and I just use the screws to keep everything aligned. Got all the support trims just sitting over here. I'm gonna let them sit overnight. Now I'm gonna start making the shelf that's gonna be on the table. Take backs and math, but I think I found the measurements, and now I'm gonna cut it. Just finished the layout for these side panels which hold up the little shelf. So now I should just be able to rip them instead of using the circular saw. I'm using painter's tape to prevent blowout. Now I have to finish this with the jigsaw, and I'm going to prevent the blowout from happening with using the reverse tooth blade. So you can see the teeth are facing down, so there won't be any blowout on the top. Also, the jigsaws have the angle of attack setting, which changes from oscillating to straight up and down. And keep it on the straight up and down for like if you want less blowout. So got that cut out. That's one of the sides. Now we have to do one more. You can see that blade worked pretty good. Can't really tell the difference if it was a table saw or a jigsaw. It's pretty good. Alright, let's start cutting the next one. So those pieces are cut out. We're going to support the little shelf, but now it's time to cut out the dado where the shelf is going to go into this. So it's time to go all the way around. Table saw, cut a dado out for the thickness of this to slide into that. There's the lines. So we're gonna have to cut out everything in between those two lines. I'm going to use this miter saw to make the dado. By put this out, it stops the saw at a distance. So by turning it in and out and aligning it to that little mark I made on tape, I can like get the correct depth. You see that little mark over there? That's the depth I want. And I just bring this down to that mark. See, there's the last tooth, a little bit more. And that's it. I know. Why the absolute fuck am I not using the table saw? Now it's time to assemble this. Some screws in and glue it up. Alright, this shelf is screwed and glued. Now I'm going to install the trim that goes around the table, and for that I'm also going to notch out over here and this piece for the shelf, which is going to sit halfway into this tabletop. Okay, now I'm going to notch out the trim so that this shelf can fit in the table, and the goal is to get 7/8 removed from the trim so that this can go down to the same elevation as half of this plywood right here. So it needs to be 3/8 into this plywood. 7/8 has to be removed from the trim, and then this will slot into the whole assembly. It's pretty self-explanatory how I removed that 7/8. So here's what I was talking about. Now we can test it. Yeah, that looks way better than I thought. Yeah, that's good. This is gonna be a nice table. Look at that. So here it's gonna be screwed in through the bottom from the little 3 1/4 by 3 1/4 piece underneath, and that's gonna hold it. So the next step is to remove the return from where the work side of the table is gonna be. So that would be all of that would have to be removed, so that you can, rest your hands without getting annoyed by this. So that's going to be cut out. However, I left 6 inches of return on each side of the table to provide a tidy backstop for books and pencils, so things just don't slide off. You'll see what I mean in just a second. Here's what I was talking about. This trim is now cut down so that your hand could it won't interfere with your hand, and there's also a 1/16. That's for the epoxy. Practicing how to do cable cut for the cables and management of the cables. So before cutting the real table, I'm just doing a little prep, and it's pretty good, so I think I'll be able to pull it off. Got the hole cut. Boom! So over here I'm doing a little bevel cut on the side of the table where you rest your hands on. There was a little problem though. So this only angles one way, but I needed to cut a piece coming in from the other way. So you can see like this piece, there's no problem because it just slides in like that and I can just cut it. The big piece would have to cut like this. And if I do that, I'm going to cut off that little return. So what I did was I used a miter saw to cut out the angle just about 12 inches. See right there? 12 inches. So this way I can just put it on the table saw. How is this? Like that. And then, so it's already set to that angle. So now I can kind of sort of do a plunge cut, but not plunge cutting. Just more like leaving it there. And now I can turn on the saw and finish the cut all the way to the end over here without cutting off my return. That's that piece right there. That worked perfectly. But now finish it off with my hand tools. Japanese pull saw. That cleared up. Just got the screws in. I'm going to continue with installing all the perimeter trim. Screwing the trim tight to the plywood tabletop is critical to avoiding leaks when pouring the epoxy. By using clamps, I ensured that it would be very tight. In order to hide the screws, I drilled 1/2-inch pocket holes to house the screws into the material, followed by 1/2-inch oak wood plugs. So we're still going around, almost done. all that's left is to screw this on. And I'm gonna do that by, pre-drilling and putting screws and glue. So all of these trim pieces are labeled and cut to size to fit around the entire perimeter of the shelf. So I always test on a scrap piece of wood my technique to see how it's gonna look, if it's gonna work, and then I can just fill those little holes.
Where did we go so wrong? This is bad! You feel shame?
16 paranoia-filled days later.
So I made a big mistake. I left this piece of trim with wet wood glue on it, face down on the table, and then that stayed like that for a day until I went to go pick it up, and I ripped off the veneer on the table and completely ruined it. So after losing my absolute shit for the past couple of days and thinking on what to do, I came up with the solution to turn this into a river table and blend that messed up piece of damage, blend it with the river. So I'll make this ugly thing a beautiful thing. All I could think of, and I bought a bunch of stuff to do that, so I'll show you. A lot of money later, and now I have this, and this is the tool I'm going to use to router out the river. I've got the 6-amp battery. It's going to cut a river into this, but not go all the way through. I'm just going to go in about 1/4 of an inch into the table with whatever design I want, and then I'm going to fill it, and that's going to be the very tricky. I'm going to pull it off. So I'm going to turn this into a river table. That's the only way I can get rid of this nasty shit over here that I did. So here's the router that I picked up, more in depth. So I have the Milwaukee trim router with a plunge base. This makes plunging into that table very easy. It's also got adjustment here, so you can set the depth and it will always come down to that depth. So this makes it very useful for what I was doing. And also gives these handles which allow for very precise controlling. Before starting that, I finished the trim without being an idiot and just leaving it to dry on the table. Anyways, let's move on. This is the biggest waste of time ever, but just to be safe, I decided to make another little tiny table to test this whole technique. Over here I'm making a river table that's just smaller. It'll be like project just where I can test the epoxy method I'm trying to use. But over here you can see I've sealed this with epoxy already. And now I'm just trimming out this tape using this gut hook blade. It works really well for this stuff. And then I'm going to fill this with and kind of make like a river table without it going all the way through the table, because I don't want to cut my table in half. So I'm just going to experiment on this table. It'll be, yeah, I'm making 2 tables now. Let's see how this goes. Perfect. Whenever I'm mixing the epoxy, just the easy way I like to measure it out equally is I just measure up the cup like 5/8 or whatever I want, and I do that to 2 cups, and I just poke a hole in it through the inside, and then I just measure up to that in both cups, and I get an equal 1-to-1 ratio, like perfectly, without having to have some fancy translucent measuring cups or anything. So this river turned out really good, and now we can now I'm sure it's gonna work on the table. So time to apply this technique that the river routed. Over here I'm using these to give me access to the edges where I can't really get the router in. So this just bumps it up a little bit and lets me just bring the blade up to like the end. So I'm using these as just a way to lift the router up over the ridge so I can just get in there. So I've just sanded everything. So sanding's done, river is done, ready to have the primer applied. So what I'm going to do is apply a coat of epoxy, very thin, to seal the wooden fibers because they behave like a straw. And if I were to just add the colored epoxy to this, the straw would basically suck the color down into itself and would form lots of streaks everywhere where the river is. Over here I have some wood filler. So I'm just filling up all the nail holes. Just grab some on my finger, like right there. I used a taping knife. It's a little bit big. Some edge banding to the exposed grain of that plywood. You see it right here? So it works by heating it up with a heat gun, and then it gets really hot. You have to like be pretty quick with it, and then just slap it on and keep applying pressure for like 5 minutes. And then you get this and it looks really good. And then have the edge stick out on the top, and then you come in with a knife and you just cut it off and then finish it with some sandpaper, and it's nice and flush. Sealed up. Now I'm gonna pour my river. I'm not gonna use masking tape because masking tape, honestly, like that's gonna take too long. I'm just too lazy to mess around with that. Try and pour it as accurately as possible. Here's how it's going so far. Pretty good. can't really record because I'm rushing and very slowly. That's the key. The river looks awesome. That is really good, like satisfying. Looks like someone actually blew their brains out on this nice river. Red river. Looks really good. I love it. What's the next step? So what I first have to do is stain this or seal it before I apply this. And same applies for this one too. So first I need to get the seal on the vertical surface before I pour this horizontal. So just before I pour the 1/16 of an inch thick epoxy over top of this table, the tabletop epoxy, first I'm going to seal this trim because right now it's been stained but it hasn't been sealed, which is going to allow the epoxy to, if I tape this off, mask it off, the epoxy still might have a chance to seep into the pores of this wood and ruin the, that's in my theory. So what I'm going to do is seal this now with this product called Premium Clear Finish, but it's matte, so it's not going to be reflective, and this is what I'm using to seal. It's going to be applied right now. Alright, so I'm in my brother's room and I'm going to pour this table in here because we're starting another project in the little work area. So, and also the temperature's better here. So it's leveled and now we're going to start pouring this thing. So all the perimeter trim and vertical surfaces have been sealed with the clear coat before this pour. Then I poured the epoxy and let it do its thing. It perfectly leveled out and turned out really good. I designed this leg to angle away from me as much as possible. Basically, it's angling towards the wall for maximum leg room. You will see how important this is later on in the video. So I'm using 4x4 as the base material. For the joint, I laid out 2 equal portions of mortise and tenon, which one will be the mortise and one will be the tenon. They'll fit into each other. Classic Canadian snowstorm, but I was still able to get down to my crawl space and finish this cut with a handsaw on a vise.
Many months later.
I used the router to router out whatever was left of this tenon. For the mortise, to get the maximum wood removed, like that. So I'm pushing on the 4x4, and I have that depth set, and it brings the whole thing right there. I just cut on the line, and that should remove most of the material. And there's going to be a bunch of chiseling. And I switched over to using the circular saw to finish off the last couple of cuts. Those little holes that I drilled help me chisel out the right amount of material from the mortise. Basically, I see the hole and I know when to stop.
Very good!
Over here, I'm drilling 2 holes in the mortise and tenon at the same time to allow for 2 wooden pins to stick into the material and hold it in place. I forgot to mention this, but I removed 1/8 of material from each side of the leg to make it thinner. And right here I'm using dowels and glue to fasten the final bottom piece to the leg. By adding this full length 3/4 inch material, the triangle formed by the table, stud, and leg is complete, and this becomes very structurally sound. Yep, that's right. That's a notch out to fit the impact driver so I can fasten the screw into the stud. Again, using dowels. By adding this piece of 3/4 inch plywood, I achieved the same thickness as the baseboard that the leg butts up against. Now everything can be double checked, just as if it was on the wall. Hole inside of a hole. The bigger hole is going to get the plug. The leg gets 2 screws and some glue to hold it in place. Pre-screwed some screws into the flange, double checked the stud locations, and set up a laser. This table was finished.